as Ross just made it clear, there's some real change but also opportunity on the horizon. Climate change is going to be a very major issue for the first term of this new federal government. We've already seen myriad net zero commitments coming from Australian listed companies. But as always, questions still remain. Do the strategies behind these commitments stand up to scrutiny? And what are the regulatory settings and investment solutions needed for a just transition as the pace of change accelerates? These are some of the things that we're going to be exploring in our first conference sessions today. We'll hear from Mark Carney. The economist and banker was the Governor of the Bank of England until 2020 and Chair of the Financial Stability Board for 6 years. He's now the Vice Chair of Brookfield Asset Management and the Head of Transition Investing. Now, we're going to hear first from Mark and the AXI CEO, Louise Davidson, and at the end of that, there's going to be about 5 minutes for questions. So if you have a question while Mark's speaking, if you pop it straight into the app, then Louise will be able to ask him that at the end. And then after that, the remainder of the panel are going to come up and join Louise on stage, Fiona Reynolds and Jeff Summerhays. Fiona was the CEO of the PRI for more than 9 years and sat on boards including the UN Global Compact, Climate Action 100, the UK Green Finance Institute and the Asset Owners Net Zero Alliance. She's now the CEO of Connexus Financial. And Jeff Summerhays is recognised for raising awareness of and driving regulatory change on climate change financial risk. He was formerly an executive board member of APRA and he chaired the Council of Financial Regulators Working Group on Climate Change. Now, among other roles, he's a senior advisor at Pollination. Louise, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Lee. And good morning, everyone. I would like to add my warm welcome to you all, both in the room and those who are joining us virtually. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I also say a big thank you to Tony Garvey for his warm welcome this morning and for giving us some things to think about further. Our first session today deals with climate change, an issue that is existential for humankind and of fundamental importance to investors. Last year's AXI conference was held in the lead-up to COP26 in Glasgow, and since then the momentum on action on climate change has continued to increase both globally and in Australia. In addition to increased action from state and federal governments, we are increasingly seeing investors and companies in Australia make net zero commitments and seek to align to the Paris Agreement. But the extreme weather events that we have seen in Australia, in the flooding around Europe over recent weeks with the heat waves, show us that there is a lot more to be done and it needs to be done with urgency. So last year, we heard from Mark Carney about expectations for COP26. And today we're privileged to have Mark join us again to update us on progress and thinking. In a moment I'll speak to Mark on these issues, and as Lee said, at the end of that we'll have just a brief amount of time for some audience questions, so please put those through to the app. And then we'll be joined by the rest of our panel for further exploration of the challenges and opportunities that we face in the investment space. So welcome, Mark. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. One of these days I do hope to tempt you to Australia in person, but for the moment we are very grateful to you for joining us virtually. We're a little over halfway now between COP26 and COP27, and there is an absolutely huge transition required to get us where we need to be. Can you give us a quick stock take on where we are, firstly in terms of country momentum, what you're seeing globally in that regard, and then secondly in terms of the investor momentum that you've seen?
Okay, well, first thing, Louise, and good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to join. I'm very tempted, don't worry, I'm very tempted to come to Australia, and hope that that will happen soon. In terms of momentum, yes, we're a little more than halfway between 26 and 27 COPs, and we're more than a quarter of the way through what needs to be the decisive decade for getting emissions down by almost 50% globally. So we've, time is running short. We came out of COP26 actually with more than I would have expected when I spoke to this group last year. 90% of global emissions covered by country commitments on net zero, including Australia. A big momentum in the corporate sector, a big momentum in the financial sector with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and then very importantly, that reinforced by the regulators, including the RBA and APRA as members of what's called the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is over 100 central banks and supervisors covering, again, more than 90% of global emissions, who are in the process of mapping into prudential regulation many of the core requirements, and I emphasize on requirements, for the largest financial institutions to manage climate-related risks and therefore open up very large opportunities. And I think so we came out of COP with the broader commitments, the tightening of the overall global commitment. This is something that was less recognized, that formally the commitment for countries was tightened from less than 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees with no overshoot, even though it is harder to hit, obviously, after 6 years from Paris. The reason for that is in part the mapping of degree warming to extreme weather. Unfortunately, over the course of the last several years, it's become more apparent the risks that are run for every degree warming that happens. So we came out with a lot of momentum, and I think the challenge is translating those commitments, those aspirations into action in this process of operationalizing. And what we're starting to see, and I'll refer back to the opening comments, what we're starting to see as those commitments are operationalized in the financial sector is that climate and relative alignment to net zero pathways is becoming an increasing driver of value in markets. And my personal view is this is just the early stages of that process, and therefore very relevant to today's audience.
So I guess one of the questions that has been pondered here is what does Australia need to do to make sure that it is an attractive investment in the climate space and avoid being left behind? What's your observation on that, Mark?
Well, I'll make an observation that the former Prime Minister made to me and then said publicly, so I'm not betraying confidences. But one of the concerns and one of the motivations of the previous government was that actually the absence of a net zero commitment, a clear net zero commitment, and an associated pathway to that reduction, and I understand the incoming government is tightening that pathway, that's a prerequisite to get the focus. It provides a framework or an anchor to investor expectations of businesses investing. In other words, if you have a pathway of reduction, the next question becomes, what are the policies and what's the likelihood the policies will come into place that are consistent with that pathway of reduction? So that's the first element. It's very hard to do this without an anchor in terms of public policy. I mean, full stop. The second thing that's necessary is a lot of what is happening, and I salute AXI for helping to lead this charge in terms of disclosure. It is a process of voluntary disclosure. I know your focus has been much broader ESG disclosure, but within climate, particularly being anchored around TCFD as a voluntary disclosure mechanism, that's been necessary. Fiona and Jeff also helped obviously lead this in their various roles. Now the issue for Australia, for the world, is to move from voluntary to mandatory, and that's what the International Sustainability Standards Board is all about. That was agreed and launched at COP, again supported by Australia, and mapping that climate disclosure, which is, as I'm sure this room knows, that is already out for consultation, and it's a reasonable prospect by 24-25, and I would hope Australia would be amongst the leaders here, that the approach of the ISSB which is very similar to the approach proposed by the US SEC, not surprisingly, because both are based off of the Tcfd, to complete my acronyms, that leading jurisdictions will move to make that disclosure mandatory. That will help give a lead. And then the third point I'll make is that, and I'm sure we'll get more into this, the moving from commitments to action, of course, you need a plan. This isn't going to happen by chance. It's not something you do on a quarterly basis. You need a net zero plan, and you need clarity around those net zero plans. And in Australia, elsewhere in the world, that is really the work that is going on now, is to map broader commitments, not just to specific metrics by 2030, 2025, those are both necessary, but actual clarity about how companies are going to get there. And then capital, particularly patient capital, again, represented in this room, is going to decide who you want to back, who you believe, and alongside engagement, help them move, but also in the process create and capture that value.
Thanks, and we will hear later today from Sue Lloyd of the ISSB. I think it is a really, it's a very important development, both on climate and on more broadly on ESG issues, to start to have more rigour around reporting and I guess giving investors confidence that what they're investing in is indeed what it says it is. So I suppose let's go to the role of investors, Mark, and particularly of interest, I think, is how, what do investors need to do to support the transition at this point, and particularly in respect to bringing along communities that are going to be impacted. There are going to be large parts of Australia that have community and workers impacted significantly by this transition that needs to occur. Talk to us about your thoughts on what investors can do to support that transition.
Yeah, and the first thing is to acknowledge that investors obviously are not in this alone and cannot do it alone. Critical actors, but there's a fundamental role for governments and for companies. And we all need to recognize the imperative of a just transition. We're not going to get to net zero unless we have sustainability in all its senses. In other words, we won't be able to proceed with the full transition unless we bring along workers and communities, and particularly those who are most affected. So how do we do that? And what are some of the principles and actions that help ensure that? The first is to be clear about where we're going. And the sooner we're clear about where we're going, the more there is time for that adjustment, as well as clarity of the necessity of that adjustment. It does not pay to deny that, for example, I know it's a hot button issue, but since earlier elephants were introduced into the room, I'll introduce another one, which it does not make sense. It does nobody favors to deny that coal is ultimately going to be phased out, and the faster it's phased out, the easier the transition is going to be for the rest of the economy. The sooner that's recognized by governments, by companies, by generators, by investors, the earlier the plans can be made to retrain, redeploy, remunerate workers, help communities that are most effective move forward with the jobs and opportunities of the future. And I have to say, at the outset, I should have said this at the outset, Australia is called the lucky country for a reason. You had luck in conventional energy resources and many other things. And of course, you have absolutely extraordinary potential that's only just beginning to be realized on the renewable side. And so seizing that will create more jobs and more opportunity. But the easier for the transition is the clarity up front, recognized first from governments, but then associated by companies and very much investors. So that's got to be part of the engagement strategy of investors. The second point I'd make And this is something that is out for consideration and out for consultation there. And if you don't mind, Louise, I'll just use this for a short commercial for the Glasgow Financial Alliance or Net Zero. There is a series of consultations that are out right now from GFANZ on net zero transition frameworks. So for financial institutions, including large pension funds, but as well as banks and insurers and others, best practice for transition plans for companies. And my third point, which is relevant to the just transition, is how to responsibly and transparently phase out stranded assets, so-called managed phase out. And what is the responsibility, and I'll speak as an investor as well, what is our responsibility as investors for the phasing out of stranded assets? Does it stop at divestment? Can we just divest our way as individual institutions to lower carbon portfolios? Obviously, we can't divest our way as a country, as an overall economy or the world. Part of what's out for consultation is a responsibility that if you have a net zero plan, and I would hope that most in this room either have adopted or considering adopting and will adopt net zero plans over time. If you have that form of plan, you also have a responsibility, as for example, Brookfield does, that if in divesting an asset, if we decide to sell an asset, to ensure that the new owner of the asset, as best as one can, is going to manage that responsibly and manage that consistent with a transition and a just transition. So I know it's a long answer to your question, Louise, I apologize, but there's two elements here. One is collectively being clear up front, not denying, acting earlier, because that creates time, clarity, and opportunity for workers and communities to transition. And then secondly, that our responsibility is to the assets we own. And with climate comes a tail responsibility to ensure that they are transitioned indeed. And we're not just engaged in portfolio decarbonization, but actually just transition of those assets in our economies.
I think it was reasonable to give a long answer, Mark, because it was quite a big question. How do we transition to a... so that's okay. Just a bit of a change in focus. So you'll be aware that Australia has put in a bid to host COP29 here in Australia in 2024 in partnership with Pacific nations. And it strikes me that one of the things that you need to do to be a host of a COP is make some pretty big commitments yourselves in order to catalyse similar commitments from others who are attending. What do you think it would mean for Australian climate policy, and what would Australia need to do to maximise its chances of being awarded the opportunity to host a COP?
Well, I think, and first, it's very good news. I was very pleased when I heard that Australia was considering making this bid, and it would, potentially provide considerable momentum to the process. So I wish you luck. I think the first thing, and it's in Australia's nature, will recognize that you are the president in this case for the transition of the world. So it is not just about local issues or regional issues, but it is about everybody. And of course, the partnership with the Pacific nations brings to the fore the very real, immediate adaptation issues, existential in some cases, adaptation issues that many small island states face. The consequences of something that's euphemistically called the protection gap in insurance, which is exactly what I guess it sounds like, which is that not only do they face these growing risks at scale, but there are no ex-ante resources to help them address it. And it is possible, and early work has started on this, but I think given the risk management expertise in Australia, I would encourage greater development, building on what is likely to come out a bit, I think, of the Egyptian COP on loss and damage, managing these types of risks, including for the small island states. But then I would very much go to issues that play to Australia's many strengths, including accelerated transition from coal generation. It's one of the key things if we don't get going collectively on this issue, we as a world are not going to make it. We need to lead in the advanced economies. Alongside that is the speed with which not just conventional wind solar storage, which again you have in abundance, but 2 years out, further acceleration, best practice on policy on hydrogen, I think will be necessary, and you can help with that. And then the third, which is delicate. Well, it's not delicate. I mean, it's necessary. I think we're all conscious of the risks of single source supply in any commodity, any good, and the extent to which the world can start and truly diversify supply chains for critical minerals for scale renewable build out. Again, huge Australian expertise in mining, global supply chains, and helping to broker some of that, or having the ability and the ambition to broker some of that in truly an impactful way globally, I think would make a real difference. And if I can just say one other thing, just as a context point, big focus, as you probably know, for the Egyptian COP on loss and damage, on Africa, and then on upping ambition globally. I think the next COP, the Emirates COP, will focus on a variety of issues, but very much on energy transition, not surprisingly, given the expertise and having greater clarity and granularity about the pathway, particularly for fossil fuels with the transition. If Australia were successful in COP29, picking up directly from that and helping to work with that, because COP presidents work together as they overlap, would be a great service.
All right, well, we'll see how we go. Mark, we're just about at the end of our time. I've had one question come through to you from our audience that I'll pose to you, and then we'll wrap up. And that is, so in the audience here today, we've got some of Australia's largest investors and largest companies. Do you have a challenge for us?
Well, I think the challenge I would put, and I'll put the challenge to the investors, and starting from a position of knowing some of you, and certainly knowing the reputation of the mandatory supras as a whole, and also again going to the points that were made in the opening comments about the importance of engagement. I think the challenge for all of us, and I'll include Brookfield in this, is to develop the expertise very rapidly to assess how well aligned our portfolios are with the transition. So which assets are, either, I mean, the easy bit is the pure green, but then the question is my exposure to a steel company, a mining company, an auto manufacturer, a tech company. Is that company itself, do I have the information from the company and the expertise and the references in order to judge whether that company is on the pathway? That's first best, but very likely for most companies, they're not on the pathway. If everybody were on the pathway, we wouldn't have a problem. So the question is whether they are converging to the pathway, a pathway consistent with 1.5 degrees, and is my investment, my engagement, helping them to get there. And that will deliver you two things. So that's the core challenge. By the way, if you're a large company, you should expect that this room, other people sitting around the table with you, are going to be increasingly asking you the questions related to that, and making a judgment about the credibility of your net zero plan. Now, the upside of all this is that there is that value that's captured because Australia, because 90% of global emissions, because people want us to transition to 1.5 degrees, that upside is not yet in the market. People don't have the full information to make those judgments. In many cases, the less, if I can put it this way, less sophisticated investors are pursuing a disengagement strategy or a divestment strategy. So they're moving away from emissions as opposed to going to where the emissions are, identifying the companies that can get them down, getting capital to them, and then riding the returns, both in terms of reduced carbon, but not just higher cash flows, but higher valuation that comes with portfolio alignment. And to support that, I'll just refer, time's up, but that you see in jurisdictions, particularly in Europe, where there is more information, there are more plans, there are more investors that are driving that. You see quite a high correlation, 70% correlation between portfolio alignment or alignment of the asset and valuation within the sector.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And we'll let you go, but thank you again for joining us. And we look forward to speaking to you again sometime in the future, hopefully in Australia, maybe even for COP29. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks very much.
And I'd like to invite Fiona and Jeff to join me on the stage. See if we can switch to this mic. Can we get this one working? Let me see, is that working? Yes, great, thank you. Hello. Hello. Thank you for joining. I mean, as always, lots of food for thought from Mark Carney. So the development of expertise is a really interesting thing to reflect on, but we might come back to that. I suppose, firstly, Fiona, I mean, you have done a lot of work on the global stage, and a lot of Mark's work is focused globally. Bring those things back to Australia, and you know, what stands out for you from what Mark had to share?
Okay, well, maybe a few things. Some of them might be the bleeding obvious, but I'm saying them because I'm going to make a point. So I think, first of all, in the Australian context, is that we really need to take the last 10 years, put it in a box over there and forget about it. And we need to move on, and we need to stop having arguments about it. But having said that, we need to not forget that over the last 2 decades, we've also lost a number of prime ministers and a number of governments to the climate wars. And we can't let that happen. As the private sector, as investors and business, we cannot let that happen again. We must support this transition, even if we don't think it's perfect. 43% is not enough of a target, but it is a start. And we need to support that target as well, or we are just going to never get anywhere. And I don't know that everybody in the room actually understands how the Paris Agreement works. So within the Paris Agreement, there is a ratchet every 5 years. So every 5 years, countries around the world have to increase their ambition. There's also a stock take within that. So in 2023, there's a global stock take, and it looks at where everybody is.
What's the session on now? What are they talking
in the world? Okay, so in 2023, there's a stock take. It looks at all the commitments that have been made, and it says, where are we at? And when we get to 2023, it'll be blindly obvious yet again that we're nowhere near where we're supposed to be. We're actually even further behind than where we should be. 2025, you have another ratchet. So the 43% that Australia legislates, and I hope it does legislate it, will increase. So I don't think we have to get too fixated on this. So, as I said, I think that the private sector really needs to understand this. It needs to get behind what the government's doing, because net zero by 2050 is still maybe possible. It's still alive, but it has a very, very, very weak pulse. And we have lost a long time. So my point is that policy is going to have to accelerate really quickly in Australia. So investors and business need to either get in front of this policy, get in front of where we're heading, or we're going to get run over by it. So that is really, our choice. And just on maybe we can talk about some of these policies that need to happen a bit later. But the other thing is that on the issue of coal and the issue of gas that, Mark sort of referred to, again, a bit of the bleeding obvious, but we cannot get out of oil and gas until we have enough other alternate energy in place. So we have to support and invest in the new energy, or we won't be able to move away from oil and gas. So the investment community, the business community, we cannot actually get to net zero without the private sector. The private sector is the answer if the right policy settings are put in place.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, what's your response to Mark's challenge and to Mark's remarks? Anything that stood out to you?
Well, thanks, Louise, and good to be with you, and nice to be back at the conference in person, and hello everybody in the room and to those online. I mean, I think as a financial sector community, I want to say something about Mark. I mean, we owe a lot to Mark Carney, and actually reflecting on what does that mean for each of us as leaders in the industry, because Mark has used his platform as a governor of the Reserve Bank, as the UN Climate Ambassador, and now as an active investor back as, I think, Deputy Chair of Brookfield, to actually champion this issue. And it doesn't matter whether it's in this room or whether it's a regulator or, an investor, this is a leadership issue, and it's an existential leadership issue. And so, I mean, I think we are well served by having leaders like Mark, and we need much more of them. And I would encourage everybody, whatever your platform is, to find your voice, have the conversation with your colleagues around your investment committees, the board tables, etc. So what is Mark's messages? I mean, net zero is the standard. Transition pressure is escalating. Responses have to become more material than they currently are. He referred to resilience, and I think we'll talk a bit about that today. Resilience is absolutely paramount and underplayed. There's challenges for sectors, namely the fossil fuel sectors, and that's only going to grow, and time is of the essence. We are rapidly running out of time.
Okay, thank you. So Fiona, you mentioned policy settings.
Yeah.
Tell us what you think we need to do to move towards that, to really support the net zero goal from a policy perspective.
Sure. So first of all, if we're going to get to net zero, we have to have a whole of economy approach to it. And that whole of economy approach needs to embed the social inclusion side as well. At the moment, what the government's talking about is really about the energy transition. But that's not enough. That transitioning the energy is not going to get us to net zero. So we have to have policies. Really, the government's got a number of policy levers that they can use, and they need to use all of them. So we do need, in what the government's put out so far, they've talked about electric vehicles, but we don't have a date to phase out the internal combustion engine. Many advanced countries do. We need that to be in place because that will then drive change. We also need to have policies around buildings, so a low carbon buildings policy. So that really is about building efficiencies, heating, building standards that we need for the future that will drive net zero. We do need some form of carbon pricing mechanism as well in place. We need a really strong renewable energy target to be in place so that, again, that we can drive innovation. Germany, for example, just put in place a 80% target for renewables by 2032. It's putting aside 2% of its land for onshore wind. We also need to have policies around agriculture, so forestry as well. We need policies in place that will change our agricultural practices. We need things around land use, so deforestation and reforestation. You actually cannot get to net zero unless you deal with land and land use. So there's a lot that needs to be done there. Nature-based solutions are really important. And then we need financial policy that actually supports net zero. So at the moment, on the one hand, you've got a government that says we've got net zero, a net zero target. Well, maybe I'll blame the prior government, but then you have financial policy that doesn't aid it. You actually have financial policy that in some ways gets in the way. So if we think about Your Future, Your Super, very many good things about it, but some of the things are the performance test doesn't necessarily allow for some of the things that we need. So we need to have joined up thinking. I think, as Mark mentioned, to me, we definitely need mandatory Tcfd reporting. And at the moment, across the globe, only about 10% of asset owners are reporting themselves against Tcfd, against the 4 indicators. And then we need the reporting. You talked about the ISSB reporting, but we do need better reporting there. I think we also need things like a taxonomy, or we need reporting. ASFI's just started working on an Australian taxonomy as well. So we need to have those sort of things that are in place so that investors can make the right decisions as well. So again, it's not just about the energy transition. The government needs to look across all of its policies, including financial policy, and make sure that it's all driving in the right direction and the same direction.
So, Jeff, speaking of leadership, you did play a leadership role for which we thank you in the Network for Greening the Financial System. From that kind of insider view, where do you see regulation going? Do you think that it is realistic for us to hope for the joined-up thinking that Fiona is asking for?
Well, I mean, regulators were a little late to the party, unfortunately, but over the last 5 years or so, that has changed and changed very, very significantly. And I think the whole pile of reasons with post-crisis reforms why they were late, but it's not really an excuse. But regulators globally are highly engaged on this issue, as they should be. It's a material risk. And whether it be conduct regulators or prudential regulators, the safety of the institutions they regulate, it is on any conference you go to, World Economic Forum, where you name it, Davos, it is one of the top 2 issues that are being discussed. So the financial institutions that you all represent, and those that are not in the room, credit providers, insurers, you are the arteries of the economy, and so we need the financial institutions to transition, and it's also a massive opportunity for you as institutions with the trillions of dollars of investment. But with that goes expectations, and those expectations are it's a highly regulated sector, and licences for banks and insurers are not handed out easily or readily by the government, and there is an expectation that goes with that, and that expectation is both a social expectation and an expectation around leadership in an issue like this. So Mark highlighted a range of foundational points which have been achieved. These are 4 which I'll give you, which I think are the next phases of regulation. The first is increasing targets and Scope 3 emissions for institutions will become a standard. Secondly, there's a growing expectation that transition funding, that institutions like yours will be actively involved in funding the transition to a lower carbon economy. We've taken 100 years to build a fossil fuel economy. We have to dismantle that and replace that in 10 years with renewables. Tcfd, Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, we heard a bit about that in some of the opening talks. Nature, natural capital, biodiversity is coming at you really quickly, and if you're not across that, you need to be. Often referred to as the twin crisis of climate and nature. Whatever the climate problem is, nature is more often than not the solution to the problem, so they do go hand in hand. Australia is actually incredibly well placed when it comes to nature, and we have a huge opportunity not only to reduce emissions but to capture carbon through nature. Nature will follow the climate playbook, but it'll do so on fast forward. It has taken a long time for us to get to grips with climate and climate risk. Nature will accelerate and play out at orders of magnitude quicker in terms of an issue than climate. And lastly, I would say that, and Fiona just referred to it, the development of taxonomies and aligned taxonomies globally and domestically. ASFI is doing some good work in this area, as we've just heard, but further specification on metrics and targets. That is still a gap, but that gap will close quickly. So those would be four that I would highlight. And growing targets, sustainably linked to everything, and impact awareness in what you're doing and how you're investing.
I've got a couple more questions for Jeff and Fiona, but then I'm keen to encourage some audience interaction as well. So we will take questions through the app, and I think we'll have some roving mics as well. So please get your questions ready. So Fiona, you've had a lot of experience internationally, particularly with investors, pension funds. Are there lessons from your experiences there that you can bring back and encourage for adoption here?
Well, okay, so there's a lot of initiatives, obviously, for the finance sector and for investors around net zero. I may be biased because I was involved in starting it, but I do actually think that the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which I continue to note only has one Australian fund in it, is the best initiative that is actually there, in terms of the fact that, as well as having the 2050 target, you've got to have a 2025 target in place, and then again, in line with the Paris Agreement, you have to ratchet up. Obviously, to get to net zero, you need to have in place a climate action plan. And I think that those climate action plans need to have, portfolio level targets. They need sub-portfolio level targets. They need to have you need to have sector plans as well. But definitely the frameworks that you use, whatever they are, need to be science-based. So there are, the science-based targets, or there is the protocol that the Asset Owner Alliance has as well. And I think the other important thing is investors need to be held to account on these things, so there needs to be robust reporting. But there's no use, obviously, just having a 2050 target if you don't have the short-term targets. As I always say, we can't wake up in 2049 and go, oh, whoops, we're not going to get there, because we haven't been measuring it along the way. So I think that, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of protocols that are there. There's a lot of reports. There's a lot of work that's out there. And I do think that, these Australian organisations, Australian superannuation funds, need to be joining with those that are around the world to work on this together. So I would just encourage that engagement with the international pension funds, who in some ways, I'm not saying every single one of them, or that there aren't some Australian funds in this room that aren't doing some great things, but I think in the main a lot of the European funds have been looking at this for a little bit longer and maybe a little bit more advanced, and are very happy to share information. And obviously there's organisations, obviously AXI, but there's IGCC, who's got a whole lot of really great frameworks and a whole lot of really great work there. And there's ASFI, who's got the roadmap and has also got information. So don't go it alone. Really work with the organisations that are there, both internationally and nationally.
Something tells me that we're not going to get to 2049 and go, oh, we haven't made it, because there'll be a few reminders along the way, sadly.
Yes.
Jeff, we speak a lot about transition, but I know that you would you have some concerns about there not being as much focus as there needs to be on resilience and on adaptation. Can you share with us?
I mean, this conversation and a lot of these conversations are about mitigating carbon, and of course that's fundamental. But the facts are that the climate has changed, changed. It's changed by 1.2 degrees. And even if we're wildly successful with mitigation, we will be doing very well to keep temperatures under 2. We are already feeling the impacts of change at 1.2. the pathway between 1.2 and 2 degrees won't be linear. It'll be, much more exponential than that in terms of the impact. Climate modelling is, is still something that we are only coming to grips with, and there is evidence to say that some of the changes we're experiencing are happening earlier than the models would have otherwise predicted. So what does that mean? Mitigate, of course, but actually we have to, as a community, as households and as business and as asset owners, adapt and build resilience into everything we do. So you as asset owners, it's important to understand the companies you own and actually how are their supply chains, how are their physical assets, how are their sources of products and services impacted by extreme events, heat events, flood events, wind events, other disruptions that flow. At Pollination, one of the hats I wear, we are working with in the agri sector, in the food sector, in the property sector, in the health sector, looking at businesses just mapping from source to manufacturing to transport to distribution to retailing, and looking at natural perils and impacts of natural perils at every stage of that supply chain. And in fact, we're doing it with some investors in this room who I know are present at this conference, going through their portfolio, investment by investment, understanding what the impacts. We have had this mindset that these natural perils, which in Australia we are going through a shocking period of it, that these are one-off events. They are not one-off events. That is the world that we are living in, and we're experiencing that at 1.2 degrees, and it'll only get worse as we inevitably move towards 2 degrees. So, Fiona, I would just make a case for, Louise, I'd make a case for adaptation and resilience, which I think is greatly underplayed in rooms like this.
Okay, thank you. Have we got any audience questions? Just a simple hand up and someone will bring you a mic. Everybody feeling a bit shy? I've got Christian down here. Someone got a mic? No, I was wrong about the mics being ready. Here we go. Sorry, it's just a long room to cross.
Thanks for all your comments. I certainly agree with the sentiment, and I think we have to start somewhere, right? And the more we do, the more you learn, and so forth. A question which I think, following on from you, Jeff, and also some of your comments, Fiona. So the pathways to go to net zero require sequencing and so forth. And as portfolio owners, if we just commit to net zero, that's really only one piece of the pie. And some of the things that we can really do a lot more work against, like to progress to net zero, may have some short-term reverse implications. If you think about even the AGL example. So sometimes actually increasing exposure in a portfolio short-term to carbon with a view to accelerate the decline over the future is actually going to drive more, both in terms of alignment to the outcome, but also potentially investment returns. So has there been, what other tools are around or likely to be around that will help asset owners explain, some of those short-term, maybe, what might look like we're going against sort of the direction that we're trying to go, but make sure there's integrity in terms of our strategy around moving to that ultimate goal.
Yeah, so it's the Mark Carney "Go Where the Emissions Are" in exhortation. Fiona, Jeff, you got?
I think that's a completely legitimate strategy, and the Brookfield, actually I'm not sure whether Brookfield's still in it or not, I've sort of lost track of the AGL saga, but the Brookfield, Cannon Brooks, that was the play, and again, we see a lot of private equity activity in this area where there are carbon intensive assets that can be accelerated to winding down those intensity, and the investors are benefiting from that transition pathway. So, I think the prohibition of just saying you can't invest in a carbon-intensive asset is unhelpful, but it goes with conditions. And as investors, as credit providers, as insurers, we need to be transparent about what we are doing. That we're better to have those assets inside the tent and work with them to transition those assets than to exclude those assets outside. If I put a regulator's hat on, outside of the regulated, community.
I can see Mary has a question, and then Kath at the back. And then I think that'll be all we've got time for.
Thanks. I'm so torn now because, Jeff, I would really like to ask you about, to follow on from those comments, the performance test. As a former regulator, you might be able to tell us how that is hindering or how it might be enabling. But I'm also keen, Louise, on the panel's thoughts on the legislative environment, on the target setting in legislation and what might progress from there. From a global examples, have we seen any greater role for climate change authorities that have been enabled by legislation, etc.? So I don't know where to go with those. You can choose.
Let's take the second, because I don't think we can deal with both.
So I think that in terms of just picking up on your point on the Climate Change Authority, I do think that for Australia we do need an independent Climate Change Authority, and it needs to have some teeth. So, I lived in the UK for a long time, and the UK government just got taken to court by a number of organisations, one being Climate Earth and Friends of the Earth. And it was because the net zero target and plan that they had actually didn't have the ambition that was going to drive the targets that they had suggested. So this has just happened in the last couple of weeks, and what's resulted in that is that the court has said that the government needs to go back and it needs to redo the plan. Basically, it's got a period of time to do that, and it needs to increase its ambition. But that is because in the UK, the way that the plan works and the climate authority works is sort of in legislation, and it reports back independently to government, and it does have some teeth. So I do think we need to think through in this country how we get something like that. Maybe it's not for now because we've just got a new government and we've got to get a whole lot of things moving, but I think in the future we need to get to that point, and I think that would give the Australian people also some comfort that someone outside of government and not government appointees are actually paying attention and measuring how we're going.
Jeff, anything to add to that?
Lawmakers and regulators are incredibly important because they set a framework, but they are often lagging indicators of things. And so there are a lot of actors, as we've heard already today, in the climate space, and they are highly motivated. We've just had effectively a change of government through community motivation around this issue. So that extends to the courts, it extends to class action firms, it extends to employees, customers, investors, capital markets, and activist groups. And these groups are and rightly so, are very passionate about this issue. So transparency, and alignment about where we're going is fundamentally important. Not just because of lawmakers and regulators, it's because actually it's the future.
We had one final question at the back there. Have you got a mic? Wait for the mic, please. And if we can make it a quick question and quick answers, because we're really running out of time now.
Thank you very much. Kat Smith, a trustee with HESTA. We've been talking quite a bit about hard to abate sectors, going where the emissions are. That's been canvassed. I'm interested in the panel's reflections on the Great Drawdown, because there are some sectors that are easier to abate and actually need to be taking carbon out, not just reducing emissions. So what do investors need to be thinking about in terms of the Great Drawdown with the sectors that are easier to abate but it can actually contribute to a net zero by going negative? Thank you.
Sorry. Again, I think Australia's incredibly well placed here, and we have immense natural assets. We have a huge agri sector. That agri sector is shifting very quickly towards more regenerative practices. They're getting rewarded for that. Credit providers, underwriters are recognising that in pricing, and they're also finding that they have a new commodity, carbon credits, and more recently, I know in New South Wales, the New South Wales government stood behind the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, where you're getting rewarded for biodiversity credits as well. So I think that's a really exciting area for Australia, and we, there's a lot of talk about technology, but actually living things, green things, capture carbon and embed it in the soil, and that's just such a free kick for us.
Yeah, I think that I know there's been a lot of controversy around carbon credits, but I think we really need to develop that market and make sure that there's credibility in it, because there is a role to play for carbon credits in the hard-to-abate sectors, and there is an answer, and we can get there.
All right. We're going to have to move on, but I'd just like you both to give us, in one sentence answer, what's your challenge for this audience? Mark had a challenge. What's yours, Fiona? One sentence.
One sentence. We don't have to. Australia doesn't just have to be a renewable energy superpower. We need to be a green finance superpower in this region. We can be. We need to think bigger, and we don't need to. Asia's doing this. Green finance centres. We don't have one. We need to be doing that. We need to think bigger and do more. Sorry.
Thank you.
More
than one
sentences.
sentence, Jeff?
Be brave. This agenda is moving incredibly quickly. What looks to be a leadership position today looks like it's pedestrian in a year's time. So you will be rewarded if you're brave, both financially and in the standing of your institutions.
Thank you very much. Join me in thanking Jeff and Fiona.